Recently on Telegram, I saw Keith Woods reposting an article by Greg Johnson called The Cloud. His thesis is that the advocacy of nationalism faces a sort of stigma because nationalism has always been associated with wars of domination and conquest. Because of that, it's hard to convince certain people that nationalism would lead to a better situation in the globe. The solution for Johnson is to establish what amounts to a white UN, where homogenous white countries negotiate peace treaties and stave off the possibility of going to war against each other. This organization would serve a number of other functions as well. It would negotiate relationships between white and non-white nations, potentially cooperating with them. It would form a defensive pact so that if a white nation were ever under attack by an entity that wished to unravel nationalism, other nations could come to their defense, and it would ensure economic as well as political cooperation in general. But there are some serious problems with this proposal, and the first one is that this cloud over nationalism is inseparable from what the aims of nationalism are for the world. To put this in simple terms, nationalists are arguing for a state of world inequality between nations. Wherever there is inequality and no overarching hierarchy for that inequality to slot into, there will necessarily be conflict owing to the fact that different nations have different needs, wants, and associations. This proposal, to bring an equalizing force to white nations so that they can have common associations and needs, defeats a fundamental premise of nationalism, which is something like the traditional principle of sum cuique, or to each his own. Some people should have their own destiny, their own determinations, and to borrow a liberal phrase, their own self-determination. If determination comes from without, if the qualities, allies, and enemies of our nations are determined by a foreign entity, then we cannot be talking about nationalism proper. Instead, we begin talking about an internationalism. Greg Johnson is presenting internationalism as if it is an extension of, rather than a repudiation of the sovereignty of nation states. When he discusses sovereignty, he comes up with an absurd strawman for the nationalist definition of sovereignty, which he says is something like complete autarky and invulnerability. While autarky is definitely a useful tool for ensuring that a state can maintain its sovereignty, it is not by itself the main criterion for it. And a kind of relative distance from military danger, such as that enjoyed by the United States or Switzerland, is also good for sovereignty, but again, it's not the primary criterion. What sovereignty actually is, according to Carl Schmitt, is the power of command. And the issue with viewing multilateral internationalism as an extension of national sovereignty is that it leads to a situation where the power of command, and thus the sovereignty, of individual nation states can and will be overruled by other states. A negotiated sovereignty is not sovereignty. Sovereignty is the power of command, simple and complete. That's why a president in a democracy, under the ordinary circumstances of the checks and balances against his authority, is not a sovereign. He only becomes sovereign in a state of exception, such as when he claims emergency powers. This is also, by the way, why the citizens in a democracy, despite how the theory goes, are not themselves the sovereigns of the state. They have no direct power of command. I said in my critique of Richard Hanania that the emergence of the League of Nations and the UN ended popular sovereignty in the US. What I meant by that is that no entity in the US, regardless of whether it's really sovereign or not, can really exercise its unbridled power of command, since it is subject now to international law and treaties. It stands to reason that the power to go to war with whoever you want is a product of true sovereignty, and a state whose ability to declare war is restricted is not a truly sovereign state. Now let's return to the point of departure. We have to acknowledge that there must be inequality, and thus war, if we agree with the premises of nationalism. How then do we dispel the cloud that hangs over nationalism? How do we convince people that nationalism will lead to a better world? The answer is actually quite simple. We need to rehabilitate war. In the first place, it's worth noting that war has an intimate connection with ethnogenesis. The French, the English, the Germans, and especially the Prussians all define themselves, or have defined themselves, against their enemies. I am an Englishman because I'm not French. I am a Prussian because I'm not German. The very core of these nations, these ethnicities, historical or not, was forged in warfare. And so to declare that war is off limits is to say that the very lifeblood of these nationalisms should be forbidden. Now, war is terrible in many respects. It leads to the loss of life, to tragedy, to destruction. But war is also positive in a sense because it gives us a reason to have boundaries and reinforces our attachment to our own kind. If we look at nationalities like cells in a body, then war is something like a pressure gradient that keeps their cell walls from collapsing into indistinction. Just as much as war can have the effect of conquest, it can also have the effect of a certain homeostasis that prevents the agglomeration of national entities into collective internationalist ones. It's worth noting here that world peace must necessarily mean world domination. This homeostasis is what prevents that world domination. One of the reasons why Germany was incapable of unification for so long was because its constituent regions were at war with each other. And this was true for feudal Italy as well as much of feudal Europe. These wars, probably because they were so limited in scale and purpose, actually had the effect of guaranteeing regional autonomy rather than causing a general subjection of smaller powers to larger ones, as one would ordinarily expect. One might note also that the reason why the Catholic Church was unable to exert a direct influence over most of Christendom, or at least a direct political influence, was precisely because these various Christian countries were at war with each other, and thus not answerable to a central globalizing authority. In a sense, the Church could have been the world's first global government. There were certainly designs to that effect coming from the Guelphs, who recommended that all nations in the world be ruled by a single, disinterested Catholic monarch. But it was, in fact, these feudal wars that prevented this early globalism from taking shape. The central conflict in political discourse, and in actual politics for that matter, is between regionalism and globalism, with nationalism, ironically, at least in the contemporary context, being on the side of regionalism. If we do as Greg Johnson recommends and cede regional authority to multilateral organizations, then what we are essentially doing is just giving up the war. We're giving up the ideological conflict and then declaring victory. The reason the desire to do away with brother wars completely has the actual effect of ending the natural homeostasis that is ordinarily presented by war. It means an end to the justifications for historical ethnogenesis, and what's more than that, it's also historically illiterate. If the emphasis of modern states was indeed on nationalism, then this means something very salient, namely that part of what constitutes a nation is shared history, and as soon as states become historical again, we will inevitably bring up past traumas and grievances and then probably go to war over them. This used to happen all the time, with nations like England and France repeatedly relitigating the same issues, springboarding off of previous military hostilities. We might like to think that the age of revanchism is over, but Russia has proven definitively that, even in spite of the New World Order, revanchism can still inspire wars. The central claim that justifies the so-called special military operation for Russia, as Putin himself has stated, is that the region of Crimea was historically Russian territory, that the people there are ethnic Russians, and furthermore, that Ukraine itself is not a distinct cultural entity historically from Russia. The whole war in Ukraine is a giant exercise in nationalist revanchism. To argue that we should never engage in revanchism requires us to revise or eliminate our nation's histories, and so in a sense, ending revanchism means ending nationalism. Again, Greg Johnson's position proves to simply be a very charitable reinterpretation of liberal internationalism or globalism. And then we arrive at another problem. Greg Johnson, like a liberal, is trying to introduce a universalism into a problem of particulars. There may be one white race, but there are many white ethnicities that don't always get along with each other and who want to maintain their own ways of life distinct from each other. Due to this inexorable asymmetry, expecting all white people to unite as a pan-European race is somewhat optimistic. I won't say that it's impossible, but we can also pose the question of whether it's actually desirable. What this kind of pan-Europeanism amounts to is the homogenization of discrete elements into a mixture, which repeats on a smaller scale what globalism does to the human race in general. It ignores the natural antipathies that exist, the differences in interest, and fundamentally, it undercuts sovereignty and self-determination, the two things that are actually at stake here. The basic fact of the matter is that intra-ethnic struggles are actually a sign of positive ethnic identification. The only way to prevent brother wars is to impose some kind of restriction on ethnic identity, like you're not allowed to be French, you have to be white. There is, in fact, an actual application of this tendency that occurs in the discourse over the war in Ukraine. I've heard certain nationalists say that Russians are no longer white because they have declared war on their brothers. Of course, this logic is never carried over transversely to Asians. Were the Japanese no longer Asian when they declared war on China? We can obviously see that this is an absurdity, an antinomial adaptation of the social construction, whiteness, to redefine the white race out of existence rather than to recognize it as a simple biological reality. The last objection I have to this notion of white internationalism is that it requires a pre-existing unity that does not actually exist. For this plan to be viable, it would require there first to be white nations, a fact that Greg Johnson does point out in his article. But there will obviously be an asymmetry here because not all nations would wake up to their ethnic identities simultaneously. What would happen in all likelihood is that one or a few nations would become ethnostates, then the remaining liberal nations would use military force to disrupt those nations' sovereignty. This would take place before it's even possible to form a multilateral structure for anything. Now, if the solution isn't white internationalism, then what can possibly occur? Of course, I don't want to be seen as quixotic. I want the white race to make a comeback as well, and I don't want to see it wiped out. But what nations have always done throughout all of history is to make alliances with each other. They do so freely, not mediated by any other party, and thus they can retain their sovereignty while finding a way to avert needless warfare. This does not require the creation of a multilateral institution, but instead can simply be done directly along diplomatic channels. So in the case where a European country becomes an ethno-state before the others, it can immediately find allies willing to support it to deter war against liberal nations. What I have in mind is similar to Metternich's Holy Alliance, an alliance made in 1815 between Prussia, Austria, and Russia. It was an attempt to bring common members of Christendom together against the encroachment of liberalism. Given that liberalism would be the foremost enemy of an emergent white nation, it becomes evident that there would be a need for another Holy Alliance in Europe. This way, we can guarantee the proliferation and success of nationalism without acquiescing to the internationalist status quo, which in reality would repudiate our own nationalism.